So Vasila said to add nonsense, so I'm here to add nonsense. Hello, everyone. I am here to talk, to take you back in time a little bit and talk about how we used to build websites back in the late 90s and the early 2000s, but in a modern way. Many of you may be sitting in this audience and thinking, why is she talking about this? She's 12. I was actually there. I just have very good skin. And many of you will be thinking, like, oh, you know, you weren't, maybe many of you weren't even there, you weren't building websites at this time, right? There's a very good chance you'll be standing on the stage in 20 years, and there's going to be people in the audience going like, we used to query containers? So, you know, it goes full circle, I promise you. My name is Sophie. As Iri said, I'm the web engineering lead at Monzo Bank, based in London in the UK. I have a website, localghost.dev, and you can find me on various social media websites at sophie.omg.lol. So, yes, I'm on a mission to bring back the spirit of the old web, that boundless creativity of the late 90s and the early 2000s, when really there were no rules, right? You could put whatever you want on your website, and no one would say, that's not how we do it anymore. And for a whole generation of internet users, having a homepage was just what you did, right? We just had our own web page. It was your space on the internet, and you could put whatever you like on there. And I'm talking the days before social media, before even Web 2.0, right? When you had websites like GeoCities or AngelFire, Tripod, remember those? And they offered free static web hosting for everyone. And some of them even had drag-and-drop builders, so you didn't even have to know HTML. And we might look back on these websites now and laugh because they look very dated compared to the sites that we're used to today. And these are all real websites, by the way, from the GeoCities archive, because GeoCities is sadly no longer with us. But I think we've gone too far in the other direction, right? I think all of the sites that we're building now kind of look the same. And in these days, these sites that we built were a reflection of yourself, right? You put whatever you liked on there, just to see what would happen. You'd see someone doing something cool on their website, and you'd view source, and you'd steal that, and you'd put it on your own site, right? And all sorts of people would build homepages, whether it was family or pets, or for themselves, like specific hobbies. Beanie Babies, anyone? Things for their visitors, so like downloads for games or Paint Shop Pro tutorials. We had graphics for other people to put on their websites as well, or of course fan sites, massive thing in the late 90s and early 2000s as well. And I think nostalgia for these kinds of websites has come right around because there's this amazing video game, if anyone's played it, called Hypnospace Outlaw, which is where you play a moderator on this version of the 90s internet that you access in your sleep. It's amazing. And I know that the developers were really inspired by all of those sites from the GeoCities time. So yeah, I recommend this game. So I would really love to see this spirit return today, this experimental and the fun side of the web. And my goal with this talk is to show you how we can be just as creative, but using modern HTML and CSS and a little bit of JavaScript. But also, I want to show you how we can do it in a way that's inclusive and accessible, because ultimately, as fun as these websites were, they were an absolute nightmare for accessibility, right? Everything was constantly flashing and moving, and we built websites using tables. We didn't even know what semantic HTML was. And I want to show you how we can achieve the same effects today while still considering our users. So I built a web page featuring my favorite 90s and 2000s web tropes. I used modern HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And I'm going to talk you through some of the things it features and show you how I recreated it. I'm going to be showing a lot of animations in this talk, just a warning. Had to. So, GeoCities sites were absolutely covered in GIFs, famously, right? Flames, construction workers, animated bullets, you know, links to emails with like wings and stuff. And it really was this art form to squeeze these animations into a really small file size. This is a website called Cameron's World, if you've seen it, cameronsworld.net, and it's a shrine to all of these incredible GIFs that you found on GeoCities. And of course, nowadays, we have no hesitation about sending each other GIFs, 2, 3, 4 megabytes, right? And we don't really think about it. Maybe we should be thinking about it, you know? But at the time, you could never do that. It was absolutely unthinkable. And if we wanted to show a GIF on our website, well, we'd just show the GIF on our website, right? Not massively different to how we do it today, use an image tag. We used to write our HTML in capitals. That was different. The problem is, right, that autoplaying GIFs are not so good for people with, motion-sensitive disorders. But the good news is that we have something that we didn't have back then, which is prefers reduced motion. If you caught Val's talk yesterday, she talked a lot about that. And these days, we can only render the GIF or play the animation if we know that our user doesn't have reduced motion enabled on our computer. So it's great because everyone can enjoy our terrible website. So here I've used a picture tag, and this allows us to specify an alternative source, and you can add a media attribute in that source with the media query for prefers reduced motion. And so if that attribute is satisfied and the user doesn't have reduced motion enabled, then we can show the GIF. Otherwise, we'll just default to the image tag with a still frame that I created just by pulling a frame out of preview and showing that instead. For bonus points, I've been quite limited for time in this talk, but you might have a button or the ability to click a GIF to pause it if someone doesn't want it to loop over and over and over. I had a Neopet shop when I was 12, and it played Teenage Dirtbag when you loaded the page. There were no controls, it was completely hidden. It just played and it looped and it auto-played. It's really distracting. You probably can't focus on what I'm saying. It's completely disorientating. Thank you. Thankfully for us, now most browsers block auto-playing audio. I'm sure many of you remember desperately trying to search through your browser windows to find which website was playing music over the top of the music you were listening to. Now, I don't think that music on sites is necessarily a bad thing. I think it's kind of a shame we don't do it anymore. It's like a little soundtrack to your page, right? It's a really great way to show your personality. That said, audio on websites really must be opt-in. As I said, browsers block autoplaying audio, so you have to do some kind of gesture on the page to indicate that you are consenting to audio, like clicking or scrolling. And a lot of websites these days do that by, oh, you've scrolled down the page, here's a video, and then they start playing it, and that's really crap. So just show, if you do have audio on your website, make sure you've got controls, and make sure that the user has to click to play it. And the nice thing is that with the Web Audio API, you can then also target this element, and you can actually create your own buttons. So you could create your own controls using the Audio API and hook it up that way. So cursor trails, a bit of a flex. I bet Vasilis had a clock cursor trail on his website. This was a great way to show off what you could do with JavaScript, or in my case, what dynamicdrive.com could do with JavaScript, because I definitely didn't do these myself. These use a technology called dynamic HTML. Well, not really a technology, it was more a collection of technologies. It was HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, which are basically the same now. It was all in the client, though. But in the late 90s, Internet Explorer and Netscape were the dominant browsers. And this was a time that we called the browser wars, because they had completely different JavaScript implementations. So if you wanted to write some scripts that would show a cursor trail on the website, you basically had to write two scripts and combine it into one. And it led to things like this. So this is from a dynamicdrive.com script to make a little trail of 3-pixel squares that follow your cursor around. And first we had to check if we're in Internet Explorer, because then we have to do something different. So we'd call document.all to see if we're in IE. And in IE, this would return a collection of all the elements in the DOM. Whereas Netscape used layer elements, which were their version of divs, that you could position absolutely, which IE didn't have at the time. So we checked for document.layers to see if we're in Netscape. And if you ever hear people, I mean, they don't do it so much anymore, but if you ever hear people talking about div layers, when I learned all of this stuff, everyone referred to them as div layers, which I didn't really clock was because in IE they were divs and in Netscape they were layers, but that's a relic from that time. So layers were treated as a completely separate document object by JavaScript in Netscape, so you could query for those. And this code, this snippet is a very small part of the code that's still there on Dynamic Drive, and it's just if else, if else, if else, all the way through. So thankfully, things aren't quite that bad anymore. But nowadays, we have Canvas, and Tim Holman has created a library of cursor effects that I think are absolutely brilliant. And they use Canvas, which is much more performant than rendering things directly into the DOM. And you get this really fine-grained control over how things are positioned as well. You can add a lot more elements, like imagine trying to render all of those elements individually. It would be quite complex. And he's used request animation frame as well, which is a function that allows us to group animations together into a single repaint for maximum efficiency. And the good news is we can use media queries in JavaScript as well. So we don't want to show an animated cursor trail if someone is sensitive to motion. So we can actually call window.matchMedia with the name of a media query and find out what the value of that is. So in this case, I'm only initializing the cursor if they don't have reduced motion enabled on their computer. We can also add event listeners to media queries, which is super cool because that means if someone changes their motion settings while they're on our website, we can actually pick up that change and then respond accordingly. So here I'm listening for the change event on the reduced motion query. If it then matches, I will destroy the cursor. Otherwise, I'll initialize it because I've just turned it on, off. Speaking of building for different browsers, lots of signs and buttons like this in the older days. Because people would just build for the browser they used. That doesn't happen now, of course. But cross-browser testing really wasn't a thing. And so as an IE user, a mere IE user, I never had Netscape, and I saw a lot of signs like this. And there was a conditional comment that you could put in your HTML that would only show up in Internet Explorer version 5 or something. Of course, we don't need to tell people to download other browsers anymore because we can use progressive enhancement. And this is where we can make sure the basics of our site works for everyone, regardless of the device or browser they're using, and then we can just put the fun stuff on top in a way that won't interrupt the experience for everyone else. And we can use the supports feature query in CSS to see if a rule or a property is supported in a browser, and then the code inside that block will only be executed if it is. So in this case, I'm using the initial letter property, which will style the first letter of, in this case, the first paragraph. And so if someone's in an unsupported browser, they'll never know that anything was supposed to be different. So this is what it looks like for someone who does have initial letter support in their browser. And this is what it looks like. If you don't, you'd never know anything was supposed to be different. All right, who remembers? Okay, so everyone laughing in this room was probably an Internet Explorer user. So in Internet Explorer, we had marquee, which I learned yesterday I could probably recreate with container queries now. Or if you're a Netscape user, you would have had the blink tag. Arguably worse than that. I actually just think that this is a terrible idea. I think, animated text effects generally, even if you don't have motion sensitivities, it makes body text really difficult to read. Don't do it. I chose not to recreate it for my site. And I thought, what else can we do with text, right? There's so many possibilities with CSS now. And I thought back to how we used to have these ridiculous headers that we'd create in PaintShop Pro or some kind of image text creator or something. And it would be an image of cool text or something that we'd use as a header, which obviously is totally inaccessible. So now we can actually do a lot with CSS that we couldn't before, and it's still text, so it's great. So for this next piece, I'm drawing inspiration from an iconic 90s classic, Microsoft Word art. Obviously not strictly from the 90s web, but for me, it really harks back to that aesthetic of 90s maximalism. So this is one of the most iconic styles, and if all goes well, I'm going to show you how I recreated it using CSS. If your employers ask you what you learned, don't tell them that you learned this. They'll never let you come back. Okay, so the important thing to know here is that you can't fill text with gradient in CSS, but you can give it a gradient background. And so what I've done here is set a background on the text, and then I've used the background clip feature, which will clip the background to the shape of the text. And then making the text transparent, you see that the gradient come through there. So, okay, the moment of truth. So I'm going to add a transform to it, yes, and scale it to look a little bit more like the real thing. Beautiful. Okay. And now we want to add a text shadow, so we get that text underneath. Well, hang on a minute. It's on top of the text. Oh, no, it isn't, because what we're looking at is actually the background. The text is transparent. So if I make that no longer transparent, you can see the text is still there, it's just on top. So what we need to do is we need to go behind, and we need to add a shadow on a parent element that will then appear behind that gradient background. Well, first I'm going to wrap it in a greater thing. I'm definitely typing all of this right now, just so fast that you can't see it. And then what we're going to do is add a drop shadow filter. And this is super cool because the drop shadow filter will use the alpha mask of the child element. And because the child element is clipped to the text, it takes the shape of the text. So here we go, add our wrapper, and we're going to add our drop shadow filter. And there we go. Microsoft Word up. But wait, there's more. This was my personal favorite, right? Much more interesting. The shadow kind of skews to the left, and this means that we need something that I think is really, really cool and have no business use case for, but we have to go into a kind of 3D mode, and we're going to use perspective, which is one of my most recent CSS discoveries. I think it's super cool. So perspective puts us into this 3D mode, and we use the perspective rule with this with a value that says, like, imagine you're standing this far away from the element. So it's kind of how far along the z-axis, that felt wrong, the z-axis, the user is standing. And then we have the perspective origin, which sets the vanishing point. So this is like, when you think of like a 3D picture, like, you know, you've got your train tracks going off into the distance, and that's the vanishing point. So for us, we want the shadow to kind of skew to the left from the bottom. So we want to set the origin to bottom left so that it kind of goes off into the distance this way. All right, so like before, we create the background gradient and we clip it to the shape of the text. And I'm actually going to use the before pseudo element to create that shadow effect. And I'm going to fill it with text because I want the shadow. Ooh, we've gone a bit. There we go. Yep. So I'm adding my content and I'm positioning it absolutely, and I'm going to put a little bit of a pasty on there to make it look a bit like a shadow. Fantastic. Cool. Now we're going to add some perspective. Nothing's going to happen just yet because we're not actually doing anything with the shadow. We need to apply some transforms, and perspective will change the way those transforms behave. So now I'm going to just set the transform origin to bottom right, so we've got the shadow coming out of the bottom right and going to the bottom left. And now we're going to rotate. So you see how flat that rotation looks. That's because we're using perspective. So if I turn off the perspective, you can see it just looks a little bit flatter. And the rotation behaves completely different when we're in the 3D mode. So now I'm going to add some more transforms to it, skew it a bit, squish it a bit to make it look a little bit more like the real thing. And then I'm going to move it down 1 rem because it's a little bit high. And there we go. 3D Word up. Oh, thanks. I can't wait to see that on the Dutch government website, Hidde. Cool. So we talked a lot about like UI effects and graphics and all of that stuff. Let's talk a bit about more like the social side of the 90s internet. So I don't know how many of you had a hit counter on your website. The sole purpose of the hit counter was to show how many people had visited your site. In my case, it was usually around 6. But, you know, so I think the hit counter kind of evolved into something a bit more sinister, which is analytics, and specifically cookie-driven analytics, because nowadays it is kind of impossible to browse around the internet without having your every move tracked in some way, shape, or form. And GDPR was obviously supposed to help that, but in actual fact it's made things worse, because now you get these incomprehensible cookie pop-ups on every single website. I actually was looking for just an image to use on this slide to illustrate what I'm talking about. And so I found this Wired article called How to Bypass Cookie Pop-Ups. And then as I was going to steal that image, this cookie pop-up popped up. So I was like, serendipity, I'm going to take this screenshot instead. I do think it's nice to know who's been looking at your website, right? I think it is cool to find out where people are coming from. It's how I know, oh, this post got picked up on Reddit, better go into hiding, or something like that. And in 2023, we have several options if we want to use analytics without cookies. So Plausible is the one I use on my own website. There's also one called Goat Counter, which is open source. I think even Google Analytics have a cookie-free option now, allegedly. The important thing to take away here is if you are implementing analytics on a site, do consider whether you can do it without cookies, because honestly, it's just nicer for everyone. Now, the hit counter isn't really the flex it once was, but because I'm going hard or going home, I am building a hit counter on my website. And it turns out Goat Counter does actually support hit counters. You can put your own code snippets on it, or you can roll your own. They've got a JSON endpoint that will tell you how many hits your website has had. So I'm using 11T on this site, so I just fetch the JSON at the build time, and I pad the start with zeros until it's 8 digits. Of course, there's going to come a time when I don't need to do that, because I've had that many hits on my website. And then I can render the digits as like styled spans in the template, and I've got like a little gradient on it, so it looks like a proper little counter thing. Now, of course, this is a static site, so it won't update dynamically. You might want to if you've got CI, you might want to give it a little cron job, so it will rebuild every so often or something like that. All right, other social things that we used to do back then. Web rings, right? Web rings were how we used to find similar websites before we had search engines. And web rings were really nice. They had this real sense of community. Every site would have a plaque a bit like this, with links to the previous and next sites in the ring. And there was like a back end somewhere, probably written in Perl, that would like point to the site that you wanted to go to next. So obviously, search engines are now supposed to be the way that we find websites. Although, I don't know about you, but I find they're getting pretty bad these days, because more and more of the sites that are out there are just kind of spam. They're either written by AI, or they're kind of just scraping the content of other people's websites. So I think we're really missing that curation of interests. And luckily, web rings are making a bit of a resurgence, right? Some people are starting to build them again now. And so I decided to build a web ring for everyone at this conference, because we're all here because we love websites. If you have a website and you love weird websites, I would absolutely love you to join. You can scan the QR code to join the website, the web ring. Please be polite, it's going on the internet. And what I'm going to do is rebuild the site after this talk. Cool. So the back end for this is actually powered by a Google Sheet. In the real world, you would probably want to do something a bit more sensible than that. So Mac's book has a great blog post about how he built a web ring using JSON. It just lives inside a Git repo, and then people can PR their sites to be added to the web ring. But I didn't fancy reviewing a load of PRs after this talk, so I thought I'll do it in a spreadsheet. And I'm using serverless, because in 2023 we don't use servers anymore. I'm using Cloudflare Workers, actually, and my request handler looks at the request, and the important bit from that request is the referrer. So when you click on a link in the webring the webring code, it directs you through this worker, and then the referrer tells us which site you've just come from. And then we'll look through the CSV data from the spreadsheet, because it turns out you can get Google Sheet data as a CSV. And it finds that referrer URL in the web ring, and then we'll find the previous and next sites in the ring and redirect you accordingly. And finally, before we had social media, the guestbook was a way of saying you'd visited and leaving a compliment. And I'm really hoping that that kind of little murmur was because some of you also use Lissa Explains It All to learn HTML. I swear, it taught me everything I know. So I thought, okay, how am I going to build a guestbook in a modern way? And you know what? I'd probably do it in the same way, just using a little bit of a different technology. So I thought I'd do something a little bit different. First of all, of course, if you've got Mastodon, I would like you to sign my guestbook right now. So scan the QR code, and you can either reply to the post, or you can just like it as well. This is a real test of like how many people actually have Mastodon. I used to do this demo with Twitter, but for reasons that are probably already quite apparent, I can't do that anymore. Cool. So my guestbook is powered by something called webmentions. And this is a protocol that notifies a website when somebody else links to you. So, for example, oh, I've got Mastodon open. No. Thanks, everyone. Yeah, so if I mention a website on my own website or on Mastodon or something like that, then people who have web mentions enabled will get notified, and they can show those mentions on their own site. And those web mentions are collected as a feed, On my own site, I collect them at build time, and then I publish them. For this particular demo, I'm doing it all client side. I've got a meta tag in the head of the site that tells web mention services that I'm looking for mentions. So I'm using a service called webmention.io, and this receives those pings for me, and then I can just fetch the feed, and then display the mentions. I get web mentions from Mastodon using a service called Bridgie. I used to use Twitter, but obviously the API is dead. So what this does is it polls the Mastodon API for any mentions of pages on my website. And then it will feed it to webmention.io. Okay, so the moment of truth, let's have a look. Sadly, Mastodon is a little bit slower than Twitter was, so let's find out. Okay. Yes, okay. Right. Oh God, my eyesight. Thanks, Hida. Oh, look at all those likes. Yes. Thank you, everyone. I feel so popular. We don't just have to do a side-by-side comparison of like 90s and now, because like I know that I've taken it very literally for this talk, but really building a website like it's 1999 is not just about literally recreating the look of websites back then, right? I think we can achieve the same feel in a modern way. And there are so many features of modern HTML and CSS that really have the potential to be so creative. Like so many of the things I've seen yesterday even have just inspired me so much. And of course, we've got things coming out like view transitions, scroll-driven animations, all of that stuff. Web animations, Val's talk was amazing. We've got really cool web fonts that you can do amazing things with, all of the things that we've seen here. And so I want you to come away from this talk and look at your next project differently, right? Does it have to look like every other site on the internet? If someone is paying you lots of money and saying this has to look like every site on the internet, do that. But if you have a little bit of creative juice there, I would say, take a little bit of inspiration from how we used to do it back then, because the web is an amazing medium. It is kind of insane what we can do on the web, right? So I want you to be experimental, and I want you to be creative. And I would, of course, love to see what you build. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was really fun. I wasn't expecting to see stuff like marquees. I feel like I haven't thought about that in a long time. So you showed a lot of the fun and I guess weird stuff about CSS. Do you have any tips for how to, I guess, apply these in real-world websites today? Like, what can you do about?
I mean, I think, there's little things like, I feel like just the little bits of surprising and delighting users, right? So like UX, little tiny UX animations, UI animations, little sound effects that just applied in the right way can just make your site feel a little bit different and behave a little bit differently. Do you have to use the same colors that everyone else is using? Can you use some cool fonts for your headings or things like that? As long as you do it in a way that is inclusive and respectful of people who are actually using the website, you don't need to just stick to the defaults, really. Yeah,
that's a good point. Are there any features from, I guess, back then that you feel like we should still be doing today? Like, should we actually have view counters on our websites today?
I mean, no. I think, I said this before, I kind of missed when we used to have like little soundtracks to the pages. But I think we were lucky that we have a lot of new technology that we didn't have back then, and so it's up to people to think, you know what, you just think of something new, right? Start a new trend. Because I don't want to see pages littered with animated GIFs, I know I had a load on there, but they are really distracting, so you have to use them sensibly, and you have to do them in a way that doesn't take away from what you're actually trying to communicate. But a little bit of animation around the side can be really cool. Scroll-driven animations, things that move as you scroll, but then stop is the important part, and don't just keep moving forever and ever. So I think, I don't think we should be looking to totally recreate this stuff in the real world. But it's just inspiration.
Okay, thank you. And do you have a dream CSS feature you'd like to see introduced?
Oh my God. I mean, I would love it to be easier to make gradient text. I do love a gradient, and it feels a little bit like a hack at the moment. So I'm hoping there'll come a time when we won't do that anymore. But honestly, I'm just like buzzed for container queries. I know everyone else is. But yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a good takeaway from this conference.
Yeah.
Container queries.
It's pretty much been the theme for every CSS conference this year. So.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.